Well, hello everybody. Richard-Yves Sitoski, Owen Sound Poet Laureate for 2019-2021 here with another video in the Practice of Poetry series. This is video number 3, Symbol, Simile, and Metaphor. Well, as a matter of fact, we're going to divide up these topics into 2 videos because they're huge and they require a more detailed treatment. So let's get started. Symbol, Simile, and Metaphor. Well, analogy, simile, metaphor, symbol, imagery. What are these things? They're basically ways of saying one thing by saying something else. And they all operate in remarkably different ways. They do different things and they have different functions in the poem. But it can be said, and I think quite safely, that they are pretty much poetry's most potent tools. If you read any of my stuff, and I hope you do, I use a lot of metaphor in mine. I don't use simile quite as much. Symbolism also not too much, but I try to use as much imagery as I can and as much metaphor as I possibly can. And these things allow even the least abstract poem to work on multiple levels at once. And I think that's where you get the richness. They all work by establishing relationships between 2 separate elements or terms. And I like using the word term because it has both a linguistic function and a mathematical function, because we're creating equations here. And the great part about it is that it's the reader who participates in creating them by probing the resemblance, testing out the propositions against lived experience, and then deciding for oneself how and if they succeed. And that's from Edward Hirsch in a book that's referred to in the references. And it's an absolutely fantastic book, How to Read a Poem. So we'll start with analogy. That's a general category of expressing one thing in terms of another. And it kind of includes metaphor and simile. It requires a minimal level of appropriateness or quote unquote accuracy for the device to succeed. Otherwise, things are going to fall flat. There's got to be some sort of relationship between the 2 things that you're going to be making analogous to one another. So when Paul Valéry says poetry is to prose as dancing is to walking, we have to ask ourselves, in what ways does this equation hold? Is it appropriate? Is it accurate? And I think it holds up fairly well, but it's not 100% of the picture, because prose can do a lot of dancing. Okay, and likewise, there's a lot of poetry that is just plain walking, if we're going to use the terms of this analogy. So you have to decide for yourself how well you approve of the analogy at any given time. Here's something maybe a little stronger, and it's from The Day Is Done by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Read from some humbler poet, whose songs gushed from his heart as showers from the clouds of summer, or tears from the eyelids start. So the wonderful thing about this little analogy is that it describes not just how, but why poems get formed. Poems are themselves forces of nature, just like clouds or the showers from the clouds. And they're also forces of human physiognomy. They're just as natural a process as crying for a human being. So it's rooted in the emotions, it's rooted in the natural world, and in both cases, poetry is something that's larger than a simple act of writing things down. So I think it's actually quite a beautiful analogy. If we move on to simile, I think we all remember that from high school. That's a comparison using the words as or like. So Juliet McCarthy, great Canadian poet, who's actually written some of the most beautiful things that I've read recently. Now your hands are still as skin shovels thrown down. I think that's absolutely huge. That is just an absolute huge simile right there. And then Maeve McGuckin, You smell of time as a Bible smells of thumbs. Oh my God. I think similes work even better when we're referring to slightly abstract things like time and concepts, and then anchoring them in something solid like a Bible, which smells of the thumbs of all the people who have thumbed it over the years. I think it's absolutely fantastic when you can do something like that. So the thing to remember with a simile is that the two elements are distinct and different. There's no strict correlation between the two. You're not saying that something is something else. You're saying that something is like something else. And that's a very, very important distinction to make, which we'll look at when we look at metaphor. And that allows this device to open outward. It expands the comparison. These two things are not the same, but they're similar in X ways. And it's the ways in which they are different that are telling. So you can almost say that the opposite of a simile is metaphor when the two terms are explicitly equated with one another. Because that's when you're taking the connotations of the one term and imparting them upon the second term. You're actually saying that something is something else. And so a good example of that, an amazing example of that, Jay Ruzeski on Stephen Hawking in one of his poems, he is one of those paintings that looks straight at everything at once. That is one of the most incredible images I've ever come across. And you know, as a metaphor, I mean, that's rock solid. So what a metaphor does is, instead of opening outward like a simile, which relies on an awareness of the differences between the two terms, here you have a collision of identities, and that's Edward Hirsch again, that condenses the two things into a composite, into one simple thing. And you can put the two of them together with a simile, the way Julia McCarthy does. My blood coiled like smoke, becoming a blurry incense. And this is how the expansion and compression work from you got the similes expansion. My blood coiled like smoke. You're likening the blood to smoke coiling. So you've got that moment where the blood is not quite smoke. It's not quite like smoke. It's resembling smoke. But then a moment later, it does become a blurry incense. And so you're compressing that and you're making it a much more strict comparison. And that becomes that much more powerful. So X was like Y and then suddenly became Z. So I'm going to leave that for there for now. As always, I'd like to thank David Medill, CFP of BMO Nesbitt Burns, former library CEO Andrew Armitage, and for their generous support of the Poet Laureate program, and to the Poet Laureate Advisory Committee and the Owen Sound and North Grey Union Public Library. And as always, I would like to acknowledge that this video was produced on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires, known as the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. I give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. See you for part 2.